So today's video is about ancestral trauma, which is otherwise also known as intergenerational trauma. This is essentially trauma that passes down through generations from one person to the next, right? So when someone goes through a traumatic event, oftentimes they adapt coping mechanisms or defense responses, right? And these can be long lasting. They can essentially last the person's entire life. Now what happens is that this person's children then adapt these same coping mechanisms and defense reactions, okay? And then their children as well. There is this notion within ancient tribal societies that not only are you carrying your own trauma within your body and your psyche, but you are carrying the trauma of the 7 generations that have preceded you, okay? So if you haven't necessarily experienced something that would create these trauma mechanisms, coping mechanisms, defense reactions, it may be because an ancestor did and you're still holding it, all right? Now also, these things that we have as cultural attitude or cultural customs, hey, this is culture, this is family, this is part of who we are, oftentimes they can actually be collective trauma responses. A group of people went through an event that was traumatic and they all kind of agreed on a way to adapt to the traumatic event. This isn't necessarily bad, but we have to understand some of these things that we consider, oh, this is just part of our culture, they may actually be adaptive mechanisms to a severe trauma that your ancestors had incurred a long time ago. So what is the evidence that ancestral trauma even exists? Well, in 1988, there was a study that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, right? They were overrepresented by 300% of referrals to psychiatric care, okay? So 2 generations down from the Holocaust survivors, essentially these grandchildren were still incurring the effects of that trauma. Also, when they looked at prisoners of war, children of prisoners of war versus children of soldiers who weren't prisoners of war in the Civil War, right? The sons and daughters of those who were prisoners of war had a higher mortality rate or didn't live as long of lives. Even though they weren't soldiers in the war, even though they didn't incur those traumas of wartime, right? They didn't live as long as the children who had parents who weren't prisoners of war. Sorry, getting a little tongue-tied. Okay, so how is trauma passed down then? Well, one of the things is core beliefs. We have core beliefs about ourselves and the world, whether we're good or not, whether people are safe or dangerous, whether we're in power, whether we can control our environment, or whether we're helpless. Trauma will cause us to form different belief systems in response to that event, okay? So if we were oppressed, we may develop a core belief that we are powerless and helpless, okay? If we didn't feel safe, we may develop a core belief that we have to control other people to feel safe, right? Now what happens is that these core beliefs that we form in response to the traumatic event, they are then passed down to our children as well. They adopt these same core belief systems. There's also epigenetics, okay? Now while this isn't concrete, there are now currently studies that are showing that we only utilize less than 10% of our DNA. And this other portion of our DNA can be turned on or off at any time, specifically to environmental circumstances, meaning that different genes will turn themselves on or off or decide to express themselves in response to a traumatic event, right? So maybe these people who were prisoners of war, they had to have a gene express themselves that they didn't need to eat as much to survive. The problem is that is not good in terms of if you're in a normal environment, and that gene could have been passed down to their children. There's also polyvagal theory, okay? This is essentially establishing that our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, by the way, go watch the video I did on that, but our autonomic nervous system, right, is inherited from our mother, meaning that if our mother was in a chronic state of fight or flight, our nervous systems will then adapt to that same response, okay? So if we had a mother who went through a very traumatic childhood, we may be adapting that same chronic fight or flight response, which will lead to OCD, which can lead to chronic anxiety, right? And we don't necessarily know the root causes of that, but it's because we adapted the same nervous system responses that our mother had adapted to a traumatic environment. The next is behavior patterns. As children, we enact what we see, okay? So if a parent form certain behavioral responses to trauma, we will reenact those behaviors in an effect to normalize them. That is often why victims of physical and sexual abuse are so much more likely to go on and re-perpetuate that same form of abuse. And it doesn't even have to be that. It could just be watching a mother who couldn't sit down, who was always going. We will reenact those same behaviors. And lastly, this may seem a little woo-woo, but it's not, and there is a karmic element. I truly believe in this, okay? So what this means is that if there's an energetic imbalance within the family lines, it will have to be addressed. So if a parent did not feel or internalize emotions or feelings that they needed to from a traumatic event, the energetic imprint behind those emotions and feelings will be passed down to the child. And the child will have to feel those emotions and release them to kind of create a balance in terms of the energy of the family line. So how do we then go about in healing ancestral trauma? Healing ancestral trauma has been a part of my process, okay? I come from a Jewish background and I've had to recognize, right? I've had to recognize, become aware, and address the cultural attitudes and customs that are trauma responses. I don't want to get canceled, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But within the Jewish culture, I have noticed certain things that are considered, oh, this is just part of the culture, that seem to be trauma responses from what the community went through, which is heavy trauma. And so I had to understand that these were actually more likely trauma responses and shouldn't necessarily be something I was going to try and reenact, all right? We also have to work through the collective unprocessed emotions of our ancestors, okay? If you had an ancestral line, right, that was abused and oppressed, right, that incurred slavery, you're going to be holding a lot of anger and rage. There's no way you won't be. You have to feel it. You have to internalize it. You have to really embody the anger and rage and eventually release it. The next part, once again, did a video about this, is forgiveness. You have to forgive those who oppress the people within your ancestral line. You also have to give the family members who reenacted this abuse and re-perpetuated onto you. All right? Now, forgiveness, as I've stated before, is the last step usually within the healing process. You do not get there until you felt the hatred, the anger, the sadness, the grief over what was done to your ancestors and over what was done to you. But until you step into forgiveness, you will always be chained by the actions of the oppressors towards your ancestors. We also have to rewire the nervous system. If there was chronic fight or flight, or your family members were shut down and depressed, their nervous system was dysregulated, you have to go and do the somatic work. You have to go and rewire and cultivate safety within your body. Last but not least, when you have children, do not re-perpetuate what was done to you. And more than anything, allow your children to fully feel the range of emotions that they want to experience. When we inhibit our children from feeling their sadness or their grief, right, we are then creating a trauma response essentially. We are telling them that you cannot feel your internal environment, you cannot become attuned to it. We release the ancestral lines from trauma when we allow our children to just be. All right, thank you for watching this video. I hope this was helpful. Please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and comment below on your experience with dealing with ancestral trauma. All right, guys, thank you for watching.